The lights dimmed in the Omaha Century Theatre on a cold November evening in 1982. Declan Thorne shifted in his seat, the worn fabric groaning under his weight. At 81, his body had betrayed him in the small ways that old age brings. Stiff knees, trembling hands, eyes that took too long to adjust to darkness. But his mind was still sharp. On the screen, the opening credits rolled for a film called The Pacific Code, a big-budget Hollywood production about World War II, about codebreakers, about heroes who cracked Japanese naval encryption and turned the tide of the war. Declan's granddaughter Vivian sat beside him, 17 years old and radiant with the kind of hope that only the young possess. She'd been the one to suggest the movie. A history project for school, she'd said. Something about cryptography in the Pacific Theatre. "This is going to be amazing, Grandpa," she whispered as the studio logo filled the screen. Declan said nothing. The film opened with a dramatic scene. A secret facility in Washington, D.C. Men in crisp army uniforms hunched over machines, frantically decoding Japanese messages. The hero, played by a square-jawed actor whose name Declan didn't recognize, barked orders with military precision, sweat on his brow, determination in his eyes. "We've got 24 hours to crack this code," the actor said, "or the entire Pacific Fleet is sitting ducks." Vivian leaned forward, captivated. Declan leaned back and closed his eyes. The film got it wrong. Not in small ways, in every way that mattered. The location was wrong. The timeline was wrong. The people were wrong. The hero on screen, this army captain with his chiseled features and his passionate speeches, had never existed. The real men who'd done the work, the ones who'd actually broken the code that saved thousands of American lives, weren't in this movie. They'd been erased, not by accident, not by oversight, by design. Declan opened his eyes and watched the rest of the film in silence. 2 hours of expensive lies. When the credits rolled and the lights came up, Vivian turned to him with tears in her eyes. "That was incredible," she said. Did you ever meet any of those men? The codebreakers?" Declan stood slowly, joints protesting. "Something like that," he said. They walked to the parking lot together. Vivian chatted about the film, about her history project, about how she wanted to write her essay on the unsung heroes of military intelligence. Declan listened and said little. What could he say? That the real story was classified for 30 years? That by the time the truth was allowed to breathe, Hollywood had already written a more marketable version? That the basement where he'd spent 18 months of his life decoding messages that would determine whether America won or lost the Pacific War didn't look anything like the gleaming facility on screen? He drove Vivian home and returned to his small house on the edge of town. Evelyn was waiting, as she always was. 79 years old and still beautiful to him, still the woman he'd married 4 decades ago when the world was on fire. "How was the movie?" she asked. Declan hung his coat on the rack by the door. "Terrible," he said. She smiled. She knew. That night, lying in bed beside his wife, Declan Thorne allowed himself to remember. Really remember. Not the sanitized version he'd carried for 40 years, not the carefully edited story he told himself to sleep at night. The truth. It started the way most catastrophes start, with a single day that changes everything. December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. Declan was 41 years old, a mathematics professor on loan from the University of Nebraska to the United States Navy. He'd been stationed at Pearl Harbor for 18 months, working in signals intelligence. Theoretical work, mostly. Pattern analysis. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would change the course of history. And then the Japanese attacked. 2,400 Americans dead in a single morning. The Pacific Fleet crippled. Battleships burning in the harbor like funeral pyres. The smell of oil and death thick enough to choke on. Declan had been on the base when it happened. He'd watched the planes come in, the rising sun emblems bright on their wings. He'd heard the bombs fall. He'd seen men die. He was still seeing them when Admiral Cyrus Bancroft summoned him to headquarters on December 8th. The Admiral's office was chaos. Staff officers moving in controlled panic, telephones ringing constantly, maps of the Pacific covered in red marks indicating Japanese positions. Bancroft himself stood at the center of it all, 60 years old and grey with exhaustion. "Captain Thorne," Bancroft said without preamble, "how much do you know about Japanese naval codes?" Declan straightened. "Some, sir. I've reviewed the intercepts we've collected. JN-25 is their primary fleet encryption. We've been attempting to break it for 2 years with limited success." "Limited success," Bancroft repeated. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Yesterday, Captain, the Japanese fleet sailed across the Pacific Ocean, assembled 400 miles north of Hawaii, and launched 200 aircraft at our base. We knew nothing. Not the location of their carriers, not their intentions, not even that they were planning an attack." He slammed his hand on the desk. "We were blind, deaf, useless. And now 2,400 of our boys are dead because we couldn't read their goddamn mail." Silence filled the room. "I need you to fix that," Bancroft said quietly. "I need you to break JN-25. I need to know where the Japanese fleet is, what they're planning, and when they're coming. Because they are coming, Captain. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning." Declan felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. "Sir, breaking a code of that complexity requires time, resources, personnel. Even with optimal conditions, it could take months, years. You don't have years, you might not have months." Bancroft moved to the window, looking out at the harbor where fires still burned. "Right now, the Japanese have 4 fleet carriers operational in the Pacific. We have 0. They can strike anywhere they want: West Coast, Panama Canal, Australia. We can't stop them because we don't know where they are." He turned back to Declan. "I'm giving you a team, 23 of the best people we have. Mathematicians, linguists, radio operators. You'll work out of the basement facility at Station Hypo. Everything you do is classified above top secret. You don't talk about it with your colleagues. You don't talk about it with your family. You sure as hell don't write home about it." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Bancroft's eyes were hard. "Because if the Japanese find out we're reading their codes, they'll change them, and then we're blind again. So this work, whatever you accomplish, stays buried, even if we win. Even if you crack every code they have, the world doesn't get to know. Is that clear?" Declan thought about his wife, Evelyn, waiting for him in their small quarters. About his daughter, Iris, 14 years old and frightened by the war. About his son, Nathaniel, 10 years old and too young to understand why the sky had rained fire. About his nephew, Elias, 19 years old and fresh out of boot camp, assigned to the carrier Yorktown. "It's clear, sir." Station Hypo was a basement. Not a metaphorical basement, an actual basement. Concrete walls, no windows, dim lighting. The air thick and stale despite the fans that ran constantly, fighting a losing battle against the Hawaiian humidity. This was where they expected Declan to save the Pacific Fleet. His team assembled over the next week, 23 people, just as Bancroft had promised. Most were young, in their 20s and early 30s, brilliant minds pulled from universities across the country. People who'd been studying linguistics or mathematics or electrical engineering when the war started, who'd volunteered or been drafted, who'd ended up here through a combination of skill and chance. Lieutenant Silas Vaughan was 28, a linguistics prodigy from Yale who could speak 7 languages and read 12. He'd been working on Japanese code intercepts for 6 months before Pearl Harbor, and had identified more pattern structures than anyone else in naval intelligence. Ensign Rosalind Kellerman, who went by Roz, was 24, and the team's best Japanese translator. She'd studied at Stanford, fascinated by the language and culture, never imagining it would make her a military asset or a target for suspicion. The FBI had questioned her twice after Pearl Harbor. Why did she know Japanese so well? Did she have connections to enemy nationals? Was her loyalty in question? Declan had shut that down fast. Roz Kellerman was Irish-American, born in Boston, as American as anyone in the room. She'd learned Japanese the same way some people learned French or German, out of intellectual curiosity, out of love for languages. "She's the best translator I have," Declan had told the FBI agents, "and I need the best. So unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, I suggest you let her do her job." They'd backed off, reluctantly. The rest of the team filled specialized roles: radio operators who could distinguish between Japanese transmission patterns, mathematicians who could analyze frequency distributions, engineers who maintained the primitive computing machines they used for code analysis, 23 people in a basement trying to crack a code that the Japanese Navy believed was unbreakable. JN-25 was a monster, a two-part encryption system that first encoded words into 5-digit number groups using a codebook, then obscured those groups using an additive cipher. The codebook contained roughly 60,000 possible values. The additive cipher changed regularly, sometimes monthly, sometimes more frequently. Breaking it required identifying which number groups corresponded to which Japanese words, then determining the additive pattern being used. Without the codebook and the cipher key, the messages were gibberish. And the Japanese had both. Declan's team had neither. They worked 18-hour days, sometimes longer. The basement became their world. They ate meals at their desks, slept on cots when exhaustion made their eyes blur, lived surrounded by intercepts and worksheets and the constant clatter of the radio receivers pulling in Japanese transmissions from across the Pacific. Progress was measured in fractions, a single word decoded after 2 weeks of analysis, a pattern identified that might, possibly, reveal part of the cipher structure. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Declan was staring at a worksheet covered in numbers when Silas Vaughan approached his desk. "We've got a problem," Silas said. Declan looked up. "Just one?" Silas didn't smile. "Washington, Army Intelligence sent out a memo. They're claiming they've got a team working on JN-25. They're telling all Navy cryptographic units to forward intercepts to them for analysis." "Army Intelligence?" Declan set down his pencil. "Since when does Army Intelligence work on naval codes?" "Since they decided they want credit for breaking them." Silas handed over the memo, official letterhead, signed by Commander Gideon Merrick, Chief of Army Cryptographic Operations in Washington. Declan read it twice. "They're not asking us to collaborate," he said slowly. "They're asking us to stop." That's what it looks like. The memo was clear. To avoid duplication of effort and ensure optimal resource allocation, all work on Japanese naval codes was to be consolidated under Army Intelligence. Station Hypo was instructed to cease independent cryptanalysis and forward all collected intercepts to Washington for processing. Declan stood and walked to the wall where they'd pinned a map of the Pacific. Red markers showed confirmed Japanese positions. There weren't many. Without code intelligence, tracking the Japanese fleet was like tracking ghosts. "How many people does Merrick have working on this in Washington?" Declan asked. "According to the memo, 50. "And how much progress have they made?" Silas shook his head. "None that I'm aware of. They've been at it since before Pearl Harbor. We've seen their analysis reports. They're nowhere close to breaking JN-25. Declan studied the map. Somewhere out there, Japanese carriers were moving, planning, preparing for the next attack. And if Station Hypo shut down, if they sent all their work to Washington to sit in some army office while bureaucrats argued over jurisdiction, people would die. American sailors, American soldiers, maybe American civilians if the Japanese decided to strike the West Coast. He turned back to Silas. "Are the phone lines to Washington secure?" "They're supposed to be." "Good." Declan picked up the telephone on his desk and placed a call. It took 10 minutes to connect, but eventually he heard the voice of Commander Gideon Merrick on the other end. "Captain Thorne," Merrick said. His voice had the smooth quality of a career politician. "I assume you're calling about the memo?" "I am, sir. I wanted to clarify the chain of command. Station Hypo reports to Admiral Bancroft and Pacific Fleet Intelligence. Are we now being placed under Army jurisdiction?" "Not officially, but in the interest of efficiency, we believe all cryptographic work should be coordinated through a central authority. That authority is Army Intelligence." "With respect, Commander, my team has been working on JN-25 for 3 weeks. We've made significant progress on identifying code groups and cipher patterns. Sending that work to Washington would mean starting over with a new team that doesn't have our institutional knowledge. Your progress is noted, Captain, but Army intelligence has more resources, more personnel, more computational capability. We're better positioned to break this code. Declan kept his voice level. How much of JN-25 have you broken so far, Commander? Silence on the line. We're in the preliminary stages, Merrick said finally. Preliminary stages, after 2 years. Captain Thorne, I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate being ordered to stop work that could save American lives, sir. Declan let that hang for a moment. My team is 3,000 miles closer to the intercepts than Washington. We can process traffic in real time. We have people who understand the tactical context of these messages because we're sitting in the middle of the Pacific Theater. Centralizing this work makes no sense unless the goal is bureaucratic control rather than actual results. Merrick's voice hardened. Captain, I'm giving you a direct order. Cease independent cryptanalysis and forward all materials to Washington. Is that understood? Declan looked around the basement. 23 people, most of them half his age, hunched over worksheets and machines and radio transcriptions, working themselves to exhaustion because they believed it mattered. Understood, sir, Declan said. He hung up. Silas was watching him. We're shutting down? No. But he gave you a direct order. He did. Declan walked back to the map. And I intend to follow it. Eventually. But it takes time to package up 3 weeks of work, organize the files, prepare everything for shipment. I'd estimate that process will take at least, 3 or 4 months. Understanding dawned on Silas's face. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Declan said, we keep working. We just don't tell Washington about it. It was insubordination. Technically, Declan was violating a direct order from a superior officer. If Merrick found out, he could face court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison, possibly. But Declan had spent 4 decades teaching mathematics to college students. He understood probability. He understood risk assessment. And he understood that the probability of Army intelligence breaking JN-25 in time to matter was effectively 0. His team had a chance. Small, maybe, but real. So they kept working. In secret now. They didn't report their progress, didn't send updates to Washington, didn't acknowledge the daily messages from Merrick asking about the status of the file transfer. They just worked. January became February. February became March. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. Ros Kellerman was analyzing a batch of intercepts from early December, messages sent just before Pearl Harbor. She'd been comparing number groups across multiple transmissions, looking for repeated patterns that might indicate common words. I've got something, she said. The whole basement went quiet. When someone said they had something, everyone stopped. Declan walked to her desk. Show me. Ros pointed to her worksheet. This number group, 03791, appears in 40% of the intercepts we've collected, always in the same position, always at the start of the message. A header, Silas said, leaning in. Standard protocol for military communications. Could be a routing indicator. Or a date marker, Declan said. Japanese military format puts the date at the beginning of transmissions. They spent the next 8 hours testing the theory. If 03791 was a date marker, they could use it to reverse engineer part of the codebook, match the number groups to known dates, identify the pattern, expand from there. By midnight, they decoded their first word. By morning, they'd decoded 30. By the end of the week, they'd broken 15% of the JN-25 codebook. It wasn't complete, wasn't enough to read full messages, but it was progress, real, measurable, undeniable progress. And then they found the word that changed everything. AF. 2 letters that appeared in dozens of intercepts throughout March and April, always in the same context, always associated with words they decoded as attack and preparation and operation. The Japanese were planning something big, something focused on a target called AF. "What's AF?" Silas asked. That was the question. AF could be anywhere, a location code in the Japanese system that corresponded to some base, some island, some piece of territory in the Pacific. "We need the location code book," Roz said. "The Japanese use two-letter designators for every significant location in the theater. AF is one of them. But without the code book, we're guessing." Declan stared at the intercepts spread across his desk. The Japanese were planning an attack. Somewhere. Soon. And if Station Hypo couldn't figure out where... "Make a list," he said. "Every possible target in the Pacific that makes strategic sense. Then we'll narrow it down." They came up with 17 possibilities. Hawaii, Australia, the Aleutian Islands, Samoa, Fiji. The list went on. AF could be any of them. But Declan had a theory, a hunch, based on decades of teaching probability and pattern analysis to students who thought mathematics was just numbers on a page. "It's Midway," he said. Silas looked up. "How do you know?" "I don't. But look at the intercepts. The Japanese are talking about needing long-range aircraft, about refueling operations, about approaching from the northwest. Midway fits. It's remote enough to be vulnerable, important enough to be worth a major operation, and positioned perfectly to threaten Hawaii if they capture it." "That's speculation," Roz said. "It is," Declan agreed, "so let's test it." The plan was simple. Brilliant and simple. They contacted Midway Island and instructed the base commander to send an unencrypted message in clear English, reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. The message should sound routine, mundane, just a minor logistical problem. If the Japanese were monitoring American radio traffic, they'd intercept it, and if AF really was Midway, they'd report it in their encrypted communications. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message. "AF is short of water." "We've got them," Declan said. The Japanese were planning to attack Midway Island, and now, thanks to Station Hypo, Admiral Bancroft knew exactly where to position the Pacific Fleet to meet them. Declan drafted a report that night, 3 pages summarizing everything they'd learned. The breakthrough in the codebook, the identification of AF as Midway, the projected timeline for the Japanese attack based on the intercept traffic. He delivered it to Bancroft personally. The Admiral read it twice. Then he looked at Declan with an expression that was equal parts respect and exhaustion. "How certain are you?" "About the codebook breakthrough?" "Completely certain. We've verified it across hundreds of intercepts." "About AF being Midway?" 90%. The water trick confirms it. "About the timing?" Declan hesitated. "The intercepts indicate early June, probably the 4th or 5th. Bancroft set the report down. "If you're right, Captain, you just gave us the first real chance we've had to hit back at the Japanese fleet since this war started. If you're wrong, I'm sending our carriers into a trap that will lose us the Pacific." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Bancroft stood and walked to his window. Dawn was breaking over Pearl Harbor. The damaged battleships had been refloated or removed, but the scars remained. "Because I'm about to bet everything on your analysis. Every carrier we have left, every pilot, every sailor. If Midway turns out to be a diversion, if the real attack comes somewhere else..." He didn't finish the sentence. Declan thought about the basement, about his team, 23 people who'd worked themselves past exhaustion for 4 months, about Silas and Roz, and all the others who'd believed in this when no one else did, about Elias, his nephew, 19 years old and stationed on the Yorktown, one of the carriers that would be sent to Midway if Bancroft trusted this intelligence. "Sir," Declan said quietly, "I stake my career on this. I stake my reputation, and I stake my nephew's life. Because Elias serves on the Yorktown, and I know that carrier's going to be there." Bancroft turned. "Your nephew?" "Yes, sir. Seaman Elias Thorne. He enlisted last year. Wrote me letters about how excited he was to serve, how proud he was to be part of something that mattered." Declan's voice didn't waver. "If I'm wrong about Midway, sir, I'm not just losing the war. I'm killing that boy." The Admiral studied him for a long moment. "Get back to your basement, Captain. Keep decoding. I need every piece of intelligence you can give me between now and June." Declan saluted and turned to leave. "Captain," Bancroft called after him, "when this is over, when we know whether Midway was right or wrong, you and I are going to have a conversation about Army intelligence and Commander Merrick, because I'm guessing he doesn't know about any of this." "No, sir, he doesn't." "Good, let's keep it that way." Declan returned to the basement and told his team. They had 3 weeks to decode as much of the Japanese battle plan as possible. 3 weeks to give Admiral Bancroft every advantage they could. 3 weeks before the carriers sailed to Midway, before Elias sailed to Midway. The work intensified. 18-hour days became 20-hour days. The basement never slept. There was always someone at the radio receivers, always someone analyzing intercepts, always someone decoding. They mapped out the entire Japanese operation. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of support vessels, 200 aircraft. The attack would come from the northwest on June 4th, just as Declan had predicted. On June 1st, the carriers left Pearl Harbor. Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet. Elias was on the Yorktown. Declan didn't tell anyone on his team, didn't let it show on his face, just kept working. On June 3rd, he received a letter. Elias had written it 2 weeks earlier, before the carrier departed. "Uncle Deck," the letter began, young handwriting, full of energy. "I can't tell you where we're going or what we're doing, but I wanted you to know I'm ready. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. You taught me that mathematics is about finding patterns in chaos. Well, war is chaos, and I'm going to find my pattern. Take care of Iris and Nathaniel for me. Tell them their cousin is doing something that matters. Love, Eli." Declan folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Then he went back to work. The battle was coming, and in a basement 3,000 miles from Midway Island, 23 people who would never fire a shot, never fly a plane, never sail a ship, prepared to fight the most important battle of their lives, with pencils and paper and numbers on a page, because that was all they had, and somehow, impossibly, it might be enough. June 4th, 1942, began in darkness. Not the darkness of night. Station Hypo never truly experienced night. The fluorescent lights in the basement burned 24 hours a day, casting everything in their pale, sickly glow. This was a different kind of darkness. The darkness of waiting, of knowing that 1,300 miles to the northwest, young men were about to die, and there was nothing Declan Thorne could do to stop it. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight. His team had been rotating shifts, trying to maintain round-the-clock coverage of Japanese radio traffic, but Declan couldn't sleep, wouldn't sleep. Not today. The intercepts had been coming in since midnight, Japanese carriers launching aircraft, radio chatter between flight leaders, weather reports, navigation updates. Everything Declan's team had predicted was happening exactly as they'd said it would. 4 Japanese carriers, approaching Midway from the northwest. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanding, the same man who'd led the attack on Pearl Harbor. 200 aircraft ready to strike the island, destroy its defenses, and clear the way for a Japanese invasion force. Except, Admiral Bancroft had believed Declan's intelligence, had positioned Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the Japanese search radius. The Japanese didn't know they were there. The trap was set. Declan stood at the war map, red markers showing the positions they'd decoded from intercepts. Silas Vaughan sat at the primary radio receiver station, headphones pressed tight against his ears, transcribing every transmission the Japanese sent. Ros Kellerman worked through the decryption, her fingers flying across worksheets, matching code groups to their known values. The rest of the team filled the basement, all 23 of them present, despite the early hour. No one had gone home. No one wanted to miss this. At 0600 hours, the first American aircraft launched from Enterprise and Hornet. Declan didn't know that. Couldn't know it. Radio silence from the American carriers meant no transmissions to intercept. But he knew the battle plan. Bancroft had shared it with him the week before. Had wanted Declan to understand what his intelligence was making possible. The American carriers would strike first, hit the Japanese carriers while their aircraft were being rearmed after the Midway attack. Catch them vulnerable. If it worked, it would be the most devastating blow the Japanese Navy had suffered in 300 years. If it failed, the Pacific Fleet would cease to exist. "Captain," Silas looked up from his receiver. Japanese transmission, heavy traffic. Sounds like they're launching their midway strike now. Declan checked his watch. 0630, right on schedule. Somewhere over the Pacific, Japanese bombers were forming up, preparing to turn south toward Midway Island. And somewhere else, American torpedo bombers and dive bombers were climbing toward altitude, hunting for those carriers. "Keep monitoring," Declan said. His voice sounded calm. It was a lie. "I want every transmission decoded, flight leader communications, damage reports, everything." "Yes, sir." The hours that followed were the longest of Declan's life. They couldn't see the battle, couldn't hear it, could only piece together fragments from the intercepted Japanese radio traffic, like trying to reconstruct a painting from scattered drops of color. 0700. Japanese aircraft attacking Midway. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. The island's defenses were fighting back harder than expected. 0730. Japanese flight leader requesting second strike. First attack hadn't destroyed all the American installations. They needed to go back. 0800. Confusion in the Japanese transmissions. Something about American aircraft. Torpedo bombers inbound from the northeast. Declan's hands tightened on the edge of the map table. The American carriers had been found. Or rather, the Americans had found the Japanese first. "Decrypt everything," he said to Roz. "I need to know what's happening out there." She worked faster, pulling apart the code groups, translating the Japanese into English. The messages were frantic now. Urgent. American torpedo bombers attacking. Carriers under attack from the northeast. Multiple squadrons inbound. "They're getting hit," Silas said. "The Japanese are getting hit hard." But the intercepted traffic told another story too. The American torpedo bombers were being slaughtered. Japanese Zero fighters were cutting them apart. Most of the American planes weren't getting through. Declan listened to Roz read the translations and felt sick. Those were American pilots dying, American sailors, boys barely older than Elias, climbing into aircraft they'd probably never climb out of, pressing home attacks they knew were suicide runs. And for what? The intercepts showed minimal damage to the Japanese carriers. The torpedo attacks were failing. 0900 hours came and went. 0930. Declan was reading through the latest batch of translations when Silas suddenly sat up straight, one hand pressing his headphones tighter. "Captain, multiple Japanese transmissions. All at once. Sounds like... I can't tell what's happening. They're shouting." Roz grabbed the transcriptions as they came off the receiver, decoding as fast as her hands could move. And then she stopped. "Dive bombers," she said quietly. "American dive bombers. Attacking from high altitude." The basement went silent. Roz kept translating, her voice shaking slightly as she read the intercepted Japanese messages. "Carrier Akagi hit. Flight deck destroyed. Carrier Kaga burning. Fires out of control. Carrier Soryu under attack. Multiple bomb hits. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been struck in the span of 5 minutes. 3 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had swept aside every opponent they'd faced, were burning. Declan closed his eyes. It had worked. His intelligence had worked. Station HYPO had positioned the American carriers perfectly, had given them the element of surprise, had made this victory possible. But the battle wasn't over. Throughout the morning, more intercepts came in. The Japanese were regrouping. Their 4th carrier, Hiru, had escaped the initial attack and was launching its own strike. Against the American carriers. Against Yorktown. Declan's hand went to his pocket. To Elias's letter, which he'd been carrying since it arrived. "Uncle Dec, whatever comes next, I'm ready." He wasn't ready. 19 years old. How could anyone be ready? The Japanese strike launched at 1100. Declan tracked it through the intercepts. 18 dive bombers, 6 fighters, heading east toward the American carriers, toward Yorktown. "Captain," Silas said, "we're getting transmissions from the Japanese strike leader. They've found the American carriers. They're beginning their attack runs." Declan said nothing. What could he say? That his nephew was on that carrier, that every decoded message was bringing him closer to knowing whether Elias would live or die. The team worked in silence, decoding, translating, assembling the pieces. 3 bombs hit Yorktown. The intercepts were clinical, precise, target hit, fires observed, carrier dead in water. Yorktown was badly damaged, but still afloat, still fighting. For 2 hours, the intercepts indicated she was recovering, damage control teams getting the fires under control, getting her moving again. And then, at 14:30, a second Japanese strike. Not from Hiryu this time, from a Japanese submarine. 2 torpedoes. Yorktown listing heavily to port, flooding uncontrolled. Abandoned ship order given. Declan stood at the map table, both hands flat against the surface, staring at the red marker that represented Yorktown's last known position. "Captain?" Roz's voice was soft. "Are you—" "Keep working," Declan said. "Sir, maybe you should—" "Keep working." His voice was steady, had to be steady, because if he let it crack, if he let them see what he was feeling, the whole team would fall apart. And they still had a job to do. The battle continued without him. The war continued without him. At 1500 hours, the Japanese carrier Hiryu was located and attacked by American dive bombers. By 1600, she was burning as badly as her sister ships. All 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were destroyed or dying. The Battle of Midway was over. America had won. Declan waited until 1900 hours before he left the basement. The team was still working, processing the final intercepts, but the major actions were complete. Silas could handle the overnight shift. He walked out into the Hawaiian evening, and the air hit him like a physical blow. Fresh air, clean air. After 18 hours in the basement, his lungs didn't know what to do with it. He made it 30 feet before his legs gave out. He sat down on the curb outside the building, put his head in his hands, and allowed himself exactly 5 minutes to fall apart. Elias was probably dead. Yorktown had taken 5 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes. The abandoned ship order had been given. Some of the crew would have survived, gotten off before she capsized. But Elias was an engine room rating, deep in the ship, below the waterline. If the torpedoes had breached the hull near his station, he wouldn't have had time to get out. 5 minutes. Declan gave himself 5 minutes to grieve for the nephew who'd written him letters about finding patterns in chaos, who'd trusted him, who'd been so goddamn proud to serve. Then he stood up, wiped his face, and went home to his family. Evelyn knew immediately. She always knew. "How bad?" she asked as he came through the door. "We won, sank all 4 of their carriers. It's the biggest naval victory since, I don't know, maybe ever." "And Elias?" Declan shook his head. She crossed the room and held him while he broke the promise he'd made to himself, while he cried for longer than 5 minutes, while the weight of it crushed down on him. Iris found him later that night, sitting in the backyard, staring at nothing. "Dad?" She was 14, too young for this, too young for any of this. "Is Uncle Elias okay?" Declan looked at his daughter, thought about lying, decided she deserved the truth. "I don't know, sweetheart. His ship was hit badly. We won't know about casualties for a while." "But you said we won the battle." "We did." "Then why do you look like we lost?" "Because winning and losing weren't that simple. Because you could achieve a strategic victory and still lose the people you loved. Because war didn't care about individuals, only about numbers and positions on a map. Because winning costs something," Declan said, "and sometimes the cost is very high." They sat together in silence until Evelyn called them in for dinner. The official casualty reports came 3 days later. USS Yorktown had lost 307 men. Another 190 were wounded. The carrier herself had capsized and sunk on June 7th, 3 days after the battle. Seaman Elias Thorne, 19 years old, was listed as killed in action. He died in the second torpedo strike, below decks, doing his job. Declan read the report in Admiral Bancroft's office, standing at attention, keeping his face neutral. "I'm sorry, Captain," Bancroft said. "I know he was your nephew." "Yes, sir. The work you did made this victory possible. I want you to know that. Without your intelligence, without Station Hypo, we wouldn't have known where to position our carriers. We'd have lost Midway. maybe lost Hawaii. Your nephew's sacrifice, and the sacrifice of everyone on Yorktown, it mattered. Thank you, sir. Bancroft studied him. Are you going to be able to continue? I need you and your team operational. The Japanese still have carriers. We'll be fighting them for years. Declan thought about the basement, about the work, about whether he could go back down there and decode more messages, send more young men into more battles. I'll continue, sir. Good, because I have some news. Washington has officially recognized the value of communications intelligence. They're creating a new joint Army-Navy cryptographic command. Very exciting development. Something in Bancroft's tone made Declan look up. Sir? Commander Merrick sent a telegram. Army intelligence is taking credit for the intelligence breakthrough that led to Midway. They're saying their team in Washington broke the JN-25 code and provided the crucial intelligence about Japanese intentions. The words took a moment to register. They're saying Army intelligence broke the code. That's correct. The code that my team broke, that station hypo broke. I'm aware, Captain. Declan felt something cold settle in his chest. Sir, we did the work. We spent 4 months breaking JN-25. We identified Midway as the target. We decoded the Japanese battle plan. Washington didn't do any of that. Merrick ordered us to stop working on it. I know. Then why are they getting credit? Bancroft sighed and sat down at his desk. Politics, Captain. The ugliest word in the English language. Army intelligence wants to expand its budget and authority. They need a success story to take to Congress. Midway is that story. So they're lying. They're claiming jurisdiction over a project that happened to succeed. Technically, since Merrick ordered all cryptographic work to be coordinated through his office, he can argue that Station Hypo was working under his authority. We ignored his orders. Did you? Because according to the official record, you were preparing to transfer your work to Washington. The fact that the transfer hadn't been completed when the intelligence became actionable is just timing. Declan stared at the Admiral. You're saying we can't dispute this? I'm saying it's more complicated than that. Bancroft pulled out a folder. The intelligence you developed, the methods you used, the code groups you identified, all of that is classified. If we publicly credit Station Hypo, we have to explain how you broke the code, which means telling the Japanese that JN-25 is compromised. They already know. They have to know after Midway. They suspect. They don't know for certain. And as long as we maintain operational security, they might keep using variations of the same encryption system, which means we can keep reading their mail. Bancroft leaned forward. But if we have a public fight over who gets credit, if we put the details in official reports that might be leaked or declassified, we lose that advantage. So Station Hypo disappears. Station Hypo continues working. You continue working. You just do it quietly. While Army intelligence holds press conferences. Yes. Declan thought about his team. 23 people who'd worked themselves to exhaustion, who'd broken an unbreakable code, who'd made this victory possible, who would never be recognized for it. What about my team, sir? Do they know? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. Bancroft's expression softened slightly. Captain, I fought to get you credit. I argued with Washington for 2 days, but the decision came from above my head, above everyone's head. This is about winning the war, not about recognition. My nephew died in this battle. I know. And now we're going to let the people who tried to stop our work take credit for it. Bancroft stood. I don't like it any more than you do, but I need Station Hypo operational. I need you and your team breaking codes. And if the price of that is letting Merrick hold his press conference, then that's the price we pay. Declan was quiet for a long moment. Is there anything else, sir? Actually, yes. Bancroft pulled out another document. I'm reassigning you, effective July 1st. The cold feeling in Declan's chest turned to ice. Reassigning me. To Naval Intelligence Headquarters in California. Administrative position. Coordinating cryptographic operations across the Pacific Theater. You're taking me out of Station Hypo. I'm promoting you. You'll have more authority, bigger picture view of intelligence operations. Who's taking over Hypo? Commander Merrick is sending someone from Washington, lieutenant commander who worked with Army intelligence. Apparently he has experience coordinating multi-service operations. Declan understood. Merrick was consolidating control, taking credit for the success, then taking over the operation that had produced it. And the easiest way to do that was to remove Declan, the one person who could dispute the official story. This is because I ignored his orders. This is because Washington wants unified command of communications intelligence.
You're a talented cryptanalyst, Captain, but you're not a political operator.
The position I'm offering you is a genuine promotion. Better pay, less stress, no more 18-hour days in a basement. I built Station Hypo. I know. My team, the methods we developed, the institutional knowledge we've accumulated over 4 months. You're just going to hand that over to someone from Washington who doesn't understand the Pacific Theater. I'm following orders, Captain, just like you'll follow yours. Declan stood there, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The recognition stolen, the command taken, his nephew dead, and now this. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. This is wrong, morally wrong. We did the work. We should get the credit. And keeping me in command of Hypo is the right decision for the war effort, regardless of what Washington politics demand. Bancroft's expression hardened. You're absolutely right.
But I don't have the authority to change it. Neither do you. So here's what's going to happen, Captain. You're going to take this promotion. You're going to go to California. You're going to do excellent work in your new position. And you're going to keep your mouth shut about who really broke JN25. For how long? Forever, if that's what it takes. This is classified, Declan. You know that. You signed the papers. Everything you did at Station HYPO is top secret. You can't talk about it, can't write about it, can't tell your wife or your children or anyone else. That's the deal. Even after the war? Especially after the war. Because after the war, people are going to want heroes. They're going to want a simple story about how we won. And that story doesn't have room for complicated truths about bureaucratic rivalries and who really did what. Declan felt something break inside him, something he couldn't name. My nephew died believing his sacrifice mattered. It did matter, but no one will know.
The official story will say Army intelligence provided the intelligence, that some team in Washington broke the code. Elias died because of intelligence that Station Hypo provided, and the world is going to be told someone else did our work. Bancroft's voice was quiet. Yes. That's not right, sir. No, it's not. But it's the world we live in. They stood in silence for a moment. I'll take the promotion, sir, Declan said finally. I'll go to California. I'll do the job. But I want it on record, somewhere, somehow, that Station Hypo broke JN25, that my team did the work. There will be classified reports, internal documentation. The truth will be preserved, even if it's not public. Classified reports that no one will read for 50 years. Probably longer. Declan saluted. Then I guess that will have to be enough. He left Bancroft's office and walked back to Station Hypo one last time.
The team was working when he arrived, same as always. Silas at the receivers, Roz at the worksheets, 23 people doing work that no one would ever thank them for. He stood in the doorway watching them. They'd won the most important intelligence victory of the war so far. They'd broken an unbreakable code. They'd saved thousands of American lives, and their reward was silence. Declan thought about Elias, about the letter in his pocket, about young men climbing into aircraft and ships, fighting battles they might not survive, trusting that the intelligence they received was accurate. His team had given them that, had earned that trust. And if the price of keeping that trust was anonymity, was letting someone else take credit, was spending the rest of his life never speaking about the most important thing he'd ever done, then that was the price. He stepped into the basement and closed the door behind him. "Listen up," he said. The team turned. "I want to tell you about a battle, about what happened at Midway, about what you accomplished." He told them everything, about the 4 Japanese carriers sunk, about the American victory, about how their intelligence had made it possible. He didn't tell them about Elias. That was private. And he didn't tell them about the credit being stolen. They'd find out soon enough. For now, for this moment, he wanted them to know they'd won, even if no one else would ever know it, even if history would record a different story. They had won, and sometimes that had to be enough. August 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities that had been targets were now just memories. The fighting that had consumed the Pacific for 4 years was done. Declan Thorne stood on the pier in San Francisco, watching the ships come home. He was 44 years old. He'd spent the last 3 years in California, coordinating intelligence operations from a desk, shuffling papers, managing personnel. Important work, they'd told him, vital to the war effort. He'd hated every minute of it. Now it was over, and he was going home, back to Omaha, back to Evelyn and Iris and Nathaniel, back to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The Navy had offered him a permanent position, career track, admiral's stars if he played the game right, learned the politics, stopped asking uncomfortable questions about who got credit for what. He'd declined. "I'm a mathematics professor," he'd told them. "That's what I was before the war. That's what I'll be after." They'd accepted his resignation with handshakes and commendations and a medal he didn't want. The Navy Cross, for exceptional service in combat intelligence operations. The citation was vague, carefully worded to avoid mentioning anything classified. It didn't mention Station Hypo, didn't mention JN-25, didn't mention Midway, didn't mention Elias. The medal was nice, heavy, gold and blue ribbon. It sat in a drawer at home, and Declan never looked at it. Life in Omaha was strange after the war. Normal. That was the word everyone used. Things were getting back to normal. But Declan didn't remember what normal was supposed to feel like. He returned to his position at the University of Nebraska, teaching calculus to undergraduates who'd either been too young to fight or had come back with the GI Bill, looking for a future. Good kids, most of them, eager to learn. They had no idea what their professor had done during the war. He'd signed papers, non-disclosure agreements that would follow him to his grave. Everything he'd worked on at Station Hypo was classified, top secret, not to be discussed with anyone who didn't have the appropriate clearance, which meant everyone. His wife knew he'd done something important. She'd seen the toll it took, seen him after Elias died, seen the way he'd come home from California with something broken inside him. But she didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer them. "I worked in intelligence," he told people when they asked about his service. "Nothing exciting, lots of paperwork." It was easier than the truth. Easier than explaining that he'd helped win the most important naval battle in American history and couldn't tell anyone about it. The first time it really stung was in 1947. A colleague at the university, Professor Gerald Matheson, approached him after a faculty meeting. "Did you see the article in Time magazine?" Gerald asked. "About the Battle of Midway. Fascinating stuff. Apparently, Army intelligence had cracked the Japanese naval codes before the battle. Gave our carriers the element of surprise." Declan kept his expression neutral. "Is that right?" "Amazing work." The article interviews the head of Army Cryptographic Operations, Commander Merrick. Says his team in Washington spent 2 years breaking the code. Real genius-level stuff. "I'm sure it was. Were you anywhere near that kind of work during the war?" "No," Declan lied. "I was in administrative coordination. Very different." Gerald nodded and moved on to other topics. Declan went home that night and found the Time magazine article. There was Gideon Merrick, photographed in his uniform, standing in front of a bank of computing machines. The article called him a cryptographic pioneer and a hero of the Pacific War. There was a quote, "My team worked around the clock to break the Japanese encryption systems. When we finally cracked JN-25, we knew we'd given Admiral Nimitz the intelligence he needed to win at Midway. It was the proudest moment of my career." Declan read it twice. Then he put the magazine in the trash. Evelyn found him sitting in the dark an hour later. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine." "That article. It was about your work, wasn't it? The code you broke." He looked at her. "I can't talk about it." "I know, but it was yours." "Doesn't matter anymore." She sat beside him.
Does it bother you that someone else is taking credit? Declan thought about that, really thought about it. I don't know, he said finally. Part of me wants to scream the truth, tell everyone that it wasn't Merrick, wasn't his team in Washington, that it was 23 people in a basement at Pearl Harbor who did the real work. But Elias is still dead. Whether people know the truth or not, he's still dead, and recognition won't bring him back. They sat in silence. The men you worked with, Evelyn said, do they know what they accomplished? They do. Then maybe that's enough. It wasn't, but Declan nodded anyway. The years passed. 1950 became 1960. Iris graduated from college, got married, had children of her own. Nathaniel followed his father into teaching, became a high school mathematics instructor in Lincoln. Declan grew older. His hair went grey, then white. His hands developed a slight tremor. The memories didn't fade, though. Station Hypo, the basement, the intercepts, Elias. He never forgot. In 1956, Hollywood released a film called Battle Stations, a big-budget war movie about the Battle of Midway. Declan took Evelyn to see it. The film portrayed Army intelligence as the heroes who broke the Japanese codes. There was a dramatic scene where the head cryptanalyst, played by a handsome actor in his 30s, decoded the crucial message that revealed the Japanese plan to attack Midway. "We've got them," the actor said, pointing at a map. "They're coming here, Midway Island, June 4th. The scene showed him personally delivering the intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. Medal ceremony at the end. Recognition. Glory. None of it was real. Declan watched the entire film without saying a word. When it ended and the lights came up, Evelyn squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just a movie." "It's a lie." "Yes, but it's a convincing lie." They went home, and Declan tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that the truth was preserved somewhere in classified files, that someday, maybe decades from now, the files would be declassified and people would know. But he was 65 years old. He probably wouldn't live to see it. The second film came in 1962, 20 years after Midway. This one was even bigger, even more elaborate, more scenes of heroic army cryptanalysts, more dramatic reveals, and still no mention of Station Hypo. Declan didn't go to see it, but his students did. They came to class talking about how amazing it was, how brave those codebreakers had been. "Professor Thorne," one of them asked, "did you work with any of those guys during the war, the Army intelligence people?" "No," Declan said. "Different department." "Oh, well, it must have been pretty amazing to be part of that whole effort, though, even if you weren't one of the stars." "Yes," Declan said quietly. "It was amazing." He retired from teaching in 1968 at age 67. University of Nebraska gave him a small ceremony, gold watch, plaques thanking him for his service to education. No mention of his service to his country. That same year, Silas Vaughan called him. They hadn't spoken in years. Life had pulled them in different directions after the war. Silas had stayed in intelligence work, risen through the ranks, retired as a full commander. "Dec," Silas said over the phone. His voice sounded old. They were all getting old. "Have you been following the declassification proceedings?" "What declassification?" "Some of the World War II intelligence files are being reviewed. There's a chance, a small chance, that they'll release information about Station Hypo." Declan's hand tightened on the receiver. "When?" "Could be years. They're talking about a 25-year rolling declassification schedule. Anything from 1947 and earlier would become eligible for review starting in 1972. That's 4 years from now." "I know. I thought you should know. After all this time, we might finally be able to tell the real story." Declan thought about that. 26 years of silence. And now, maybe, the truth. "Silas, even if they declassify the files, will anyone care? It's been 26 years. Most people don't remember the details of Midway anymore. It's just another battle in the history books." "We'll care. The team will care. And maybe that's what matters." Maybe. They talked for another 20 minutes, caught up on families, health, the state of the world. Before they hung up, Silas said something that stuck with Declan. "We did good work, December.
Important work. Whether anyone knows it or not, we saved lives. That has to count for something. It does, Declan said. I just wish Elias could have been one of them. 1972 arrived. The declassification happened, just as Silas had predicted. Thousands of pages of World War II intelligence documents were released to the National Archives, including files on Station Hypo. Declan drove to Washington to see them. Silas came too. So did Ros Kellerman, now 55 years old, retired from a career in linguistics at UCLA. 3 members of the original team, standing in the National Archives reading room, looking at the fruits of their labor from 30 years ago. The files were heavily redacted. Black bars covered names, covered operational details, covered anything that might reveal specific cryptographic methods. There was a report on the breaking of JN-25. It acknowledged that a naval intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor had contributed to the effort. But the specifics were blacked out. The names were blacked out. Station Hypo was mentioned once, in a footnote. Subordinate element of Naval Intelligence Pacific Command. That was it. Declan read through 200 pages of partially redacted documents. Nowhere did it say that Station Hypo had broken the code. Nowhere did it credit the team by name. Ros was crying quietly in the corner. 30 years, she said. We waited 30 years, and this is what we get? Our names crossed out? Silas put a hand on her shoulder. The methods are still classified. They can't release our names without explaining exactly what we did. And if they do that, then adversaries could use it against us. I know. I understand the reasoning. She wiped her eyes. I thought someday people would know. Declan looked at the documents spread across the table. Proof that Station Hypo had existed. Proof that they'd done important work. But not proof of what they'd accomplished. Not proof that could correct the historical record. They might release more later, he said, not believing it. More comprehensive files. Once enough time has passed. We'll be dead by then, Ros said. She was probably right. They left Washington that afternoon, flew back to their respective homes, went back to their lives, and the silence continued. 1977. 5 more years. The declassification had changed nothing. The history books still credited Army intelligence. Hollywood still made movies about the wrong heroes. Silas called another meeting. We're running out of time, he said. 12 surviving members of the original 23 had gathered at a hotel in San Diego. Most were in their 70s now, a few in their 80s. If we don't tell this story ourselves, no one will. We signed NDAs, someone pointed out, 35 years ago, and the work is partially declassified now. We're not revealing anything that isn't already in the public domain. We're just adding context. They spent 3 days planning, interviewing each other, reconstructing the timeline, writing down everything they remembered about those months in the basement. The result was a book, self-published, 200 pages titled The Basement Warriors, The True Story of Station Hypo. Declan wrote the chapter on Midway, about the intercepts, about the water trick, about decoding the Japanese battle plan in real time. He didn't write about Elias. That was still too personal. They printed 5,000 copies, sent them to libraries, universities, military historians, took out small advertisements in academic journals. The response was underwhelming. A few reviews in obscure military history publications. An interesting footnote to the larger story of American intelligence in World War II. No major media coverage, no interviews on national television, no corrections to the historical record. The book sold maybe 1,500 copies. The rest sat in boxes in Silas's garage. We tried, Silas said when they met for dinner 6 months later. At least we tried. Declan nodded. He was 76 years old, tired, ready to stop fighting. Maybe it's not about being remembered, he said. Maybe it's about knowing, ourselves, that we did something that mattered. That's not enough, Ros said. She was frailer now, her voice weaker. I wanted my grandchildren to know. I wanted them to understand what their grandmother did during the war. Then tell them. I can't. They'll look it up. They'll find the official history. They'll think I'm lying.
And she was right, because that's exactly what happened to Declan 3 years later, 1980. His granddaughter, Vivian, was 17, bright, curious, passionate about history. She'd decided to write her junior year research paper on the Battle of Midway. "Grandpa," she said one evening, sitting at his kitchen table, "I found your book, the one you wrote with your Navy friends." Declan's heart sank. "Did you? It's really good. The part about breaking the code, about figuring out the Japanese were going to attack Midway. That's incredible." "Thank you. But," she hesitated, "I tried to verify it, for my paper. I need primary sources, you know, and I can't find anything that backs up what you wrote. All the history books say Army intelligence broke the code. There's no mention of Station Hypo doing the work you described." "The history books are wrong. That's what I thought at first. But Grandpa, I found articles, academic journals, even declassified government documents. They all say the same thing. Army intelligence in Washington broke JN-25 in early 1942. Declan closed his eyes. "I showed my teacher your book," Vivian continued quietly. "She said it's not a credible source. She said it contradicts the established historical record, and unless I can find corroborating evidence, I can't use it in my paper." "What did you say?" "I told her you were there. You worked in naval intelligence during the war. You wouldn't lie about this." "And?" "She said maybe you were confused, that memory can be unreliable, especially after 40 years, or that maybe you were part of a different project and got the details mixed up." Vivian's voice cracked slightly. "Grandpa, you're not lying, are you? You really did this?" Declan opened his eyes and looked at his granddaughter. 17 years old, her whole life ahead of her, smart enough to question, to research, to think critically. And she was asking if her grandfather was a liar. "I'm not lying, Vivian. Every word in that book is true. Station Hypo broke JN-25. We identified Midway as the target. We decoded the Japanese battle plan. We made that victory possible." "Then why doesn't anyone know?" "Because the government classified the truth, and by the time they declassified parts of it, the false story had already been told so many times that it became accepted history." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's not fair." "No, it's not. You should fight it. Go to the newspapers, make them listen." "I'm 79 years old, sweetheart. I don't have a fight left in me. And even if I did, what would I say? That the government has been lying for 40 years, that Hollywood got it wrong, that every history textbook needs to be rewritten. If it's the truth, yes." Declan reached across the table and took her hand. "Sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as we think it should. Sometimes the story that gets told is the story that's easiest to believe, the one that fits the narrative people already have in their heads." "That's cynical." "It's realistic." Vivian pulled her hand back. "I don't accept that. There has to be a way to make people understand what really happened. If you find one, let me know." She left that night frustrated, angry, determined to prove her grandfather wasn't crazy or confused or lying. She couldn't. Her teacher wouldn't accept the book as a source. Vivian got a B on her paper instead of an A because she'd argued with the established historical record. She came back to Declan in tears. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I tried." He held her while she cried. "It's all right," he said. "You believed me. That's what matters." But late that night, alone in his study, Declan allowed himself to feel the weight of it. 40 years of silence. 40 years of watching others take credit. And now his own granddaughter had been punished for defending him. Maybe it would have been better if he'd never written the book, never trying to tell the truth. Maybe silence was easier. 1982. The night after watching that terrible Hollywood movie with Vivian, after coming home and remembering everything, Declan couldn't sleep. He was 81 years old. His body was failing in a dozen small ways. Arthritis, high blood pressure, the early signs of the cancer that would kill him 2 years later. He didn't have much time left, and he still didn't have an answer to the question that had haunted him for 40 years. Did any of it matter? The work mattered, obviously. The intelligence had saved lives, had won a battle, had changed the course of the war. But if no one knew? If history recorded a lie?
If his own granddaughter had been told her grandfather was unreliable, did it still matter? The next day, there was a small ceremony at Pearl Harbor, 40th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. Declan had been invited. He almost didn't go, but Evelyn convinced him. "It might be your last chance," she said gently. She knew about the cancer. The doctors had given him 2 years, maybe 3. So he went. The ceremony was small, maybe 30 people, a few veterans from the battle, a Navy admiral who gave a speech about courage and sacrifice, a wreath laying at the memorial. Declan stood at the back, unnoticed. After the ceremony, as people were leaving, a man approached him. "Captain Thorne?" Declan turned. The man was in his early 60s, grey hair, civilian clothes. "Yes? I'm Graham Whittaker. I don't know if you remember my father, Lieutenant Commander Harold Whittaker. He served on the Enterprise at Midway." "I'm sorry, I don't recall." "You wouldn't have any reason to, but he knew about you, about Station Hypo." Graham pulled out an old letter. "My father wrote this in 1945, just before he died. He made me promise to deliver it if I ever met you." Declan took the letter with trembling hands. It was addressed to Captain Declan Thorne, Station HYPO. He opened it. "Captain Thorne, we've never met. You didn't fly the planes or command the ships at Midway, but Admiral Nimitz told us after the battle about the intelligence you provided, about how we knew exactly where to position ourselves, how we knew when the Japanese were coming. My squadron lost 14 pilots that day. Good men, friends, but we won. And we won because of what you did in that basement. I know you can't talk about it. I know the world will never hear your name. But I wanted you to know that we knew. The pilots, the sailors, the men who fought. We knew someone was looking out for us. Thank you, Harold Whittaker." Declan read it twice. His eyes were wet. "Your father wrote this 37 years ago." "He did. He kept it in his desk. Made me promise that if I ever encountered anyone from Station Hypo, I'd deliver it." "How did you find me?" "Your book, The Basement Warriors. I read it a few years ago, started researching, figured out you'd be at this ceremony." Graham smiled. "Dad told me stories before he died, about the battle, about how the intelligence was so good, so precise, that it felt like magic. He said there were people who fought the war without ever firing a shot, people who won battles with their minds." "Your father survived the battle?" "He did. Flew 40 missions after Midway, made it home in 45, married my mother, raised 3 kids. He died in 75, but he lived a good life." Graham's voice was quiet. A life he wouldn't have had if you hadn't told him where to find the Japanese carriers. Declan couldn't speak. "I just wanted you to know," Graham continued, "that your work mattered, that people are alive today because of what you did. My father, me, my children. We're all here because you sat in a basement and broke a code." He shook Declan's hand and walked away. Declan stood there, the letter in his hands, tears running down his face. Evelyn found him like that 10 minutes later. "Dec, what is it?" He showed her the letter. She read it, and then she held him while he cried. Not from sadness, from something else, something he couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Validation. The knowledge that someone had known, someone had understood. "I've been asking the wrong question," Declan said when he could speak again. "All these years, I've been asking whether it mattered if people knew, whether recognition was important, whether history would remember. And? Those aren't the right questions. The right question is, did the work matter? Did it save lives? Did it change anything? And the answer?" Declan looked at the letter, at Harold Whittaker's words from 37 years ago. "The answer is yes, it mattered. Not because people will remember my name, but because Graham Whittaker exists. Because his father came home from the war. Because thousands of sailors and pilots and soldiers lived instead of died. You did that. We did that. All of us. Station Hypo. 23 people in a basement." They drove home that afternoon. Declan was quiet, thoughtful. That night, sitting in his study, he wrote a letter of his own. To Vivian. "Dear Vivian, you asked me once if it bothered me that no one knows the truth about Station Hypo, whether I regret spending 40 years in silence. I've been thinking about that, and I've realized something. We didn't do the work to be remembered. We did it because it needed to be done, because young men were dying and we had a chance to save some of them, because the alternative was to do nothing. Today I met the son of a man who survived the Battle of Midway, a man who lived because of the intelligence we provided. That man raised children. Those children will raise children of their own. How many lives come from a single life saved? How many futures exist because we broke a code in a basement 40 years ago? I'll never know. No one will ever know. But those lives exist. Those futures are real, and they exist because we did our job. So no, sweetheart, I don't regret the silence. I wish Elias had survived. I wish the historical record was accurate. I wish I could tell you stories that you could verify in textbooks. But what I did mattered, not because history remembers, because lives were saved. And maybe that's the truest victory, the one no one writes about, the one that happens quietly in the hearts of people who lived when they should have died. They're free. They don't know who saved them. They don't know about Station Hypo or JN25 or the water trick or any of it. And that's exactly what we wanted. We fought so they could live without knowing the cost, without carrying the burden, without having to thank anyone. We fought so they could be free. I love you, Vivian. Thank you for believing in your old grandfather. December. He sealed the letter and left it on his desk. 2 years later, in 1984, Declan Thorne died. He was 83 years old. The funeral was well attended. Family, former colleagues, students he'd taught over 4 decades. Commander Silas Vaughan came. 71 years old, one of the last surviving members of Station Hypo, he delivered a eulogy. Declan Thorne was my captain, my friend, my brother in arms. Silas's voice was strong despite his age. Most of you knew him as a teacher, a mathematician, a family man. But I knew him as something else, as a warrior who fought the war with his mind. He paused, looking at the crowd. I can't tell you all the details. Much of it is still classified. But I can tell you this. Captain Thorne saved thousands of American lives during World War II. He did work that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. And he did it without recognition, without glory, without anyone knowing his name. He did it because it was right, because lives depended on it. And he never complained, never demanded credit, never broke his oath of silence. That's the kind of man he was, the best kind. The funeral ended. People went home. Life continued. And Declan Thorne was buried with military honors in a cemetery in Omaha, next to a stone that read, Declan Thorne, 1901 to 1984. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, captain, United States Navy. He served in silence. 27 years passed. In 2011, the National Security Agency held a ceremony. They were posthumously awarding medals to cryptanalysts from World War II, whose work had been classified for decades. Station Hypo was finally, officially, being recognized. Vivian Thorne was 48 years old. She'd become a history professor herself, spent 20 years teaching at Georgetown. She'd written 3 books about World War II intelligence operations. She stood in front of the NSA director and accepted a medal on behalf of her grandfather. The NSA Medal for Distinguished Service, the director said, awarded to Captain Declan Thorne, whose cryptanalytic work at Station Hypo directly contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific Theater. The ceremony was small, covered by a few newspapers, a brief mention on the evening news. Most people didn't notice. But Vivian noticed. She held the medal and thought about her grandfather, about the stories he'd told, about the book no one had believed. The director invited her to speak. She stood at the podium, looking at the small crowd. Family members of other Station Hypo veterans, a few historians, NSA staff. My grandfather didn't need this medal, she said. He knew what he'd accomplished. He knew lives had been saved. That was enough for him. But I'm glad to accept it. Not for him, for history. Because the truth matters. even when it takes 70 years to acknowledge it. She paused. My grandfather taught me something in his final years. He said we fight not to be remembered, but so others can forget, so they can live in peace without knowing the cost, without carrying the burden. He was right, but I also think we have a responsibility to remember the ones who fought, to tell their stories, to correct the record when history gets it wrong. Station Hypo broke the code that won midway. 23 people in a basement did what everyone said was impossible. They saved thousands of lives. And now, finally, we can say so. She left the ceremony that afternoon and drove to Omaha, to the cemetery where her grandfather had been buried 27 years earlier. She placed the medal on his gravestone. "You were right, Grandpa," she said to the stone. "It mattered, not because people remember, but because it was true." A light rain began to fall. From her purse, she pulled out the letter he'd written her in 1982. 29 years old now, the paper yellowed and fragile. She'd carried it with her every day since he died. She read aloud the final lines. "We fought so they could live without knowing the cost, without carrying the burden, without having to thank anyone. We fought so they could be free." Her voice broke. "They are free, Grandpa. Because of you, because of Elias, because of all of you." The rain fell harder. Vivian stood there for a long time, thinking about basements and codes and young men who died at sea, about the price of victory and the cost of silence, about a man who'd fought the war with mathematics and never fired a shot, who'd won battles no one knew about, who'd saved lives that would never know his name. And she understood, finally, what her grandfather had tried to tell her. History isn't just about what gets written down, it's about what actually happened, what was real. Declan Thorne and his team had broken an unbreakable code, had given America the intelligence that turned the tide of the Pacific War. The world had forgotten, had told a different story, but the truth remained. In classified files, in small books no one read, in letters passed from father to son, in the lives of people who existed because someone, somewhere, had done the work. The rain fell harder. Vivian turned and walked back to her car. Behind her, the medal gleamed on the gravestone, catching the grey light. He served in silence, and in that silence, he changed the world.